So Machiavelli is our sort of realist. He represents the Renaissance and the focus on evidence and things in this world. So Renaissance humanism is looking back at the sources and looking at the world not through a religious perspective, but a very secular outlook. And I think Machiavelli is a representation of that. So obviously he writes The Prince, and I think on your practice test you had one question that was from The Prince. So hopefully you got that correct, because you read it earlier this year. And so basically what The Prince is, it's a political manual that explains how one should rule. And it's important because Machiavelli is arguing that leaders should not always follow Christian morals. But in fact, leaders sometimes need to do other things that might be immoral, in order to maximize their power. And he argues that maximizing one's power as a leader is beneficial to your population, because that way people will have a stable, strong government and will be free from outside interference and outside invasions. So, in other words, there's a new moral imperative, according to Machiavelli. The imperative for a leader is to be a strong leader, because that's the best thing for your people. And not being a strong leader is, in fact, being nice, being too nice to people, and not occasionally, getting rid of some of your enemies to send a message is actually now not good. So Machiavelli is significant because he's looking at the world through a very secular perspective. And the next sort of political thought, we're going to look at the divine right of kings during the era of absolutism during the 17th century. You'll notice that that's a very non-secular perspective. It's a very religious perspective. And so what we'll see, though, is that this more secular outlook from the Renaissance, we'll see it pop up in the scientific revolution and in other areas, Enlightenment, as we go forward. Now, the divine right of kings, Bishop Bousset, is our proper noun that we want to remember, for a term, if we get an essay on this. And so he argues about the divine right of kings. Kings are given this right by God to rule without interference. Without interference from nobles, without interference from parliaments. He's French. And so there's these regional law courts called parliaments. Without that, the king has this absolute right to rule. So, that's obviously the justification for absolutism. And so if you're discussing a debate or an essay perhaps on absolutism, remember that the justification for it is this divine right theory. Now, obviously, as Europe secularizes, and we talked yesterday about the secularization of Europe, so as this happens, there's going to be more of a question about politics, right? The divine right of kings theory is not going to justify why that person has power in an era where God's interaction in this world is increasingly questioned. And the deistic notions of the Enlightenment, and even before that, that mechanistic idea of the universe, which is propounded by Newton, these are going to undermine this notion that God is interacting in this world. And so we'll need a new justification for why rulers should rule, what gives them their power, and not just their power, but their legitimacy. Right? What allows them to be legitimate leaders? So, to justify this in an era without God involved in human actions, philosophers look to natural law. They look to nature to justify the rule of kings. So the natural law here of Hobbes and Locke, and this is actually one of the essay questions that some of you did. Now, Hobbes is looking at the state of nature, and as we noted, human beings are kind of these very selfish, self-centered creatures, and therefore, in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short, and Hobbes is writing this in his Leviathan. And therefore, a social contract is created between man, the population, and the government. And the social contract states that humans will give up some of their rights. In exchange, the government will provide security and protection. So Hobbes, at his basis, thinks humans have a right to live, and therefore we need to have a government that protects human living. Now, he's not going beyond this with this idea of other natural rights. That's what Locke does. But the social contract states that the government's job is to provide security for protecting humans. Now, Locke redefines social contract in his work. Locke argues that the social contract is between the people and their government, same social contract, but it's different in two ways. Two ways. Number one, it's different because the contract can be broken. And number two, it's different because the contract is about protecting natural rights. I should have said that first. So natural rights are the key. Yeah. It's not just about providing protection. It's about protecting the natural rights of human beings. And Locke argues in his second treatise on government that these rights are life, liberty, and property. Okay, so life, liberty, and property, that's great. Therefore, if the government violates those rights, the people have the right to replace the government, because the government has broken the social contract in that case. Hobbes argues that the social contract is unassailable. It's been created by early people, and when we break the social contract, it will lead to chaos. And therefore, the social contract is set. The government should be absolutist and have power and not be challenged. But Locke argues that, well, what is there to prevent the government from becoming tyrannical? So therefore, to protect these natural rights, which Locke asserts exist, and this is the foundation of the notion of human rights, to protect these natural rights, there has to be some check on the government. And that check is the people. That if the government breaks the social contract and doesn't protect natural rights, the people have the ability to revolt. Now remember the different historical context of these two thinkers. Hobbes is a generation older. He's living during the English Civil War in the mid-1700s. So remember Charles I, Cromwell, the Roundheads, and the Royalists, or the Cavaliers. Right? So Parliament versus King. So it's in this environment that Hobbes is living, and he is outraged at the violence that has occurred. The king has been overthrown, he's been challenged, there's violence in this revolution, and so Hobbes says, no, obviously, look, we're returning to, this is what it's like when there is not a government there to protect us. This is what it's like when people are exempt from laws. It's chaotic, and people die. So therefore, no. This Cromwell revolution, this Puritan revolution, or this civil war that's going on, this is not right. Locke writes one generation later, and he's writing about the Glorious Revolution, and he's justifying it. He's saying that the previous king, James II, is violating natural rights, and therefore the people have the right to overthrow him and replace him with William and Mary. And so we can say that Locke, therefore, is a supporter of some sort of constitutional system. Yeah. And by constitutional system, we're not at this point meaning a specific written-out constitution, which comes in the 18th century, in the colonies in America, in the American Constitution. But during the 17th century, what we mean by constitution is some sort of limitations on the government, some contractual limitations.